In this video, I'm going to show you a broad overview of our repertoire for white. We're going to start with the move 1e4, the best by test first move, as Bobby Fischer once said, and I'm going to present you with a repertoire based on 2 knight f3 and 3 knight c3, or vice versa, against all of black's main first moves. For example, c5, the Sicilian, e5, the king's pawn defense, e6, the French defense, and c6, the Caro-Kann defense. We're also briefly going to touch on the d6 move order as well to reach a Philidor. So for starters, let's take a look at e5. Here the 4 knights approach is well established. We play knight c3 or knight f3, and black usually does the same, knight f6 and knight c6. And we look at all the deviations along the way. I had some debate about whether I should play knight c3 first or knight f3 first, but I think that knight f3 puts more pressure on black's position. If we play knight c3, for example, most of the time it will transpose, and it avoids certain lines like the Elephant Gambit, which arises after knight f3, d5. So you may wish to play it against certain specialists in different openings if you know what your opponent plays, but it also allows other lines that are quite unique, like bishop c5 here. And black simply hasn't time for this after knight f3 because the e5 pawn is hanging. So rather than cover this, I think that knight f3 is a more suitable approach and puts more pressure on black's position straight away. So with the e5 pawn hanging, black has less options. We're going to cover all of black's moves here. For example, the Petrov defense with knight f6, the main line of course with knight c6, and the other deviations. So for example, if he plays d5, the Elephant Gambit, I think white can take, and if black plays bishop d6, I'm going to recommend the main line with d4 and knight e5. And I've looked at this quite deeply, and I think that white has very good chances for an edge here. Instead, f5 is the Latvian Gambit. This has also a kind of a cult following, but it's quite dubious and probably worse than the Elephant. And it leaves black's king quite exposed already, and I think white has a clear advantage after knight takes e5 if he knows what he's doing. So we look at some nice ideas and nice tactics there. Another option for black is d6, and this is the Philidor defense. And here I'm going to recommend d4, which is the main line. And here black hasn't got too many options actually. He should probably take on d4. This is his best move here. And I'll look at knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and bishop e7. This is the main line. And here I'm going to recommend bishop e2, followed by bishop f4, and in most cases we're going to play queen d2 and castle queenside, which is very aggressive. Instead of this, bishop f4 is another good approach, but I think this gives black more dangerous and more sharp options. For example, after castles and queen d2, black has the tricky move d5, and if we play knight db5, which is a very strong idea, attacking c7, then bishop b4 gets very tricky for white in view of the pin on the knight on c3, and the fact that his queen is also behind the knight and in front of the king. We can avoid this by playing bishop e2 instead, so that there's no need to allow this. If black gets here and he plays knight f6 or knight d7, then we can punish him for his wrong move order. If he plays knight f6, d takes e5 is very strong. We can of course play knight c3, and after knight bd7, we'll end back up in our main line against the Philidor, which I'll show you in a moment. But d takes e5 is a much better move, and after knight takes e4, queen d5 is known to be clearly better for white. I have covered this in the reference file, but I don't think I'll present it because we already have a move order against a Philidor that works. Instead, knight d7 is another option for black, but once again bishop c4 is stronger than knight c3 and leaves white with very good chances for an advantage. Instead, if we go back, black can force this position on us by playing d6, d4, knight f6, knight c3, and e5. And here I'm going to recommend knight f3 and knight bd7. And this is the mainline Philidor, and this is going to be the main focus of our videos on the Philidor. I think here that a very interesting option for white that's become really popular over the past year is rook g1, and black still hasn't found a clear way to equalize against it. I found some nice ideas here, and I think your opponents will be surprised by it and also be under fierce pressure right from the start. The idea of course is to play g4, g5, play bishop e3 next, queen d2, and castle queenside. And black is under pressure on the king side, and white will develop very quickly and attack through the center as well. So I'm quite happy with this, and I think that you can of course not bother to try to refute black's approach after e5, knight f3, d6. d4, knight f6, and just transpose back into our lines with knight c3. So I haven't gone into much detail on d takes e5 in the videos, but I have left the variations in the reference file so you can check that out. Instead, another option for black that's very solid is knight f6, and this is the Petrov defense, but for our purposes it doesn't matter, we're going to play knight c3 anyway. And in most cases, black should play knight c6 and transpose back to our main lines. Bishop b4 is an independent try. This is known as the three knights game, but I think white has a slight advantage after knight takes e5, castles, and here both bishop e2 and knight d3 are very good moves, but I think knight d3 is more straightforward. Bishop takes, d takes, knight takes e4, and bishop e2. And thanks to his two bishops, white should be slightly better in pretty much every line, no matter which option black goes for. You can go rook e8, d6, or d5, or a combination of all these moves. But in any case, I think white is slightly better, and I'll show you some ideas there. Instead, the main line is knight c6, and again we play knight c3. So the beauty of this approach is that we can play it against all of black's main first moves. Like I mentioned, c5, e5, e6, and c6. We're going to move both our knights out in some order. In some lines, it's going to be more accurate to play knight c3. In other lines, it's going to be more accurate to play knight f3 first. It just depends, but I'll explain this as we go and give you all the options. After knight c3, knight f6, bishop b5 is the main line, and this is the move I'm going to recommend. This is known as the Spanish four knights, and it's traditionally been the main line here, and I think it's very challenging for black to meet at a short time control. There are many moves for black here, but I'm going to go through the four main theoretical options here in our overview. For starters, bishop c5 is one option, but after castles, this allows the typical fork trick, knight takes e5, and I think this gives white dangerous attacking chances. In particular, if black takes back, d4, and bishop d6, we don't recapture the knight, instead we play f4, and white has very dangerous attacking chances here, and black needs to be very careful. I've given at least two options against black's main defenses here as well, as I think there are many ways to put black under pressure here. Instead, bishop d6 is a move that's often played by strong players who are playing weaker players and want to keep the position unbalanced and don't want to go down any forced draw lines or any kind of sterile, dry positions. But I think it's quite risky, and if white plays a very clever move order, then he can put black under a lot of pressure. The idea I'm referring to is d3, and this is a nice waiting move for white. If black plays a6, bishop a4, and for example h6, then we can play a3. The main point is to delay castling until black has castles. And when black does castle, in this position specifically, especially with the pawn on h6, we can hit him with g4. And this is a very dangerous idea for black. We're going to play g5 to rip open the g-file and also hopefully create a pin on the knight on f6 with our bishop. And I think black is under a lot of pressure here, and he has to be very careful. So we look at those lines in depth as well. The traditional main line here has been bishop b4, and this is symmetrical, but black can only keep the symmetry for so long. After castles, the main move is castles, but you'd be surprised at how often people have played d6 against me in online blitz games. And the first time I faced it, I didn't remember the refutation, and then I looked it up afterwards, and since then I've won the same game many times over with this line. White can play knight d5, and he's already close to winning. Taking allows e takes, and black is in trouble with his c6 knight, and in the meantime, white is threatening to take the bishop on b4 in view of the pin on the knight on c6. He also wants to play d4, followed by bishop g5. So this is a very dangerous line for black, and he's already clearly worse. Instead, castles is the main move, and here I'm going to recommend bishop takes c6. It's not the main line, but it does lead to positions that are quite easy to play for white, and I think if you know these ideas better than your opponents, then you will score many wins with it. I've certainly scored very highly with it in online blitz. Another option is d3, and this is the main line, and I'm going to cover this briefly as well, because some of the positional ideas in this are quite instructive. After d6, bishop g5, both sides keep the symmetry for now, and we'll check this out we'll see a couple of games with this as well, and some classic games too. Instead, we'll look at bishop takes c6 mainly, and after d takes, white plays d3. And the big idea is to transfer this knight around to g3 and build up an attack on the black king. White's pawn structure is very solid, black faces problems defending his e5 pawn, and his double pawns on the queen side are a long-term weakness. Black does have two bishops, however, but the position is quite closed, and the bishops can't be used very well anytime soon. After bishop g4, for example, I'll show you one line. This tries to prevent our knight e2 idea, but we can play h3 instead. And after bishop h5, a cool maneuver for white is king h2, with the idea of rook g1 and g4. and on the next move white will transfer his knight around to g3 and build up a very strong attack on the king side. And black's bishop on b4 will be left with nothing to do. So that's one option, and there are many other ideas for white in this line, and we'll go through many model games and talk about all the different plans for both sides. Instead, knight d4 is the main theoretical equalizer for black. This line tends to lead to a lot of forced draws if white plays down the very main lines, but I have some ideas here too. So here I'm going to recommend no less than 3 options for white. Bishop c4 is the move you should play if you're playing somebody, if you're playing someone that you don't mind a draw against, or someone that you don't think is well prepared and is just bluffing you. If you know the forcing lines here, then the main line is just a draw, and it's been played many times, but there are also some dangerous ideas for white. In particular, if black plays knight takes f3 check here, we can play g takes f3, which is very surprising, but also in keeping with our strategy, and in keeping with some other lines in our repertoire. We open the g file, we can play rook g1, and one of the original games in this line by Back Row, black only managed to survive for 19 moves. So this is very dangerous for black. Instead, bishop c5 is the main line for him, and tends to lead to a lot of forced draws, but if you know the theory here and your opponent doesn't, then he could just end up a lot of material down. So this is worth knowing. Knight takes e5 has always been considered dubious for white, but I am going to cover it in our bonus chapter, as it's been played with great success by some really strong Chinese players recently. So there must be something to it, and I've checked it out there, and you can see my analysis in the bonus chapter. Instead, my main recommendation is going to be castles. And I think this is the most durable line that you can play. Your opponent also won't be expecting it, and it leads to interesting positions that are nothing like the bishop c4 lines or the knight takes e5 lines, and your opponent probably hasn't studied it too much. Here black has a couple of options. He can play knight takes b5, and after knight takes c6, he should really kick the knight back early, and we'll see why in the videos. Knight back to c3, d6, d4, and queen c7. And this has been played a lot by strong players recently. Dmitry Andreikin in particular has played a few different moves here, and I'm going to mainly recommend bishop g5, but we're also going to look at games with a4 and h3, as the positions are quite similar, and we'll spot many different ideas here. This is more about knowing plans and ideas than forcing variations, but we'll see all these ideas for white and also for black, and we'll be very familiar with this by the time you've watched the videos and studied the lines, and I think you'll score very highly with this too. Instead, the most critical move for black is c6, and here again I'm going to give 2 options for white. Bishop c4 in one line allows early simplification, but it's very tricky, and in fact the most played move here actually loses by force for black. And oddly enough, white players haven't exploited this when they've got here. The move d5 is the most played move, but it loses due to e takes, c takes, and the typical piece sacrifice, knight takes d5. This actually transposes to a well-known line of the anti-Sicilians, and in that case white knows the trap, and black players have ceased falling into this. But here people still fall for this, and a lot of white players don't take advantage of the opportunity. So we're going to look at that in this chapter as well, and I think bishop c4 is a dangerous try for white in view of this. Black has one move that equalizes cleanly, but if he doesn't know this, then I think this is a very good practical try. I think the most dangerous thing to do is to switch between this and bishop d3, which is another interesting option and prevents all the early simplification from black. The main line runs knight takes f3 check, queen takes, and d6, and here just be very careful. I got this position against GM Matthew Turner back in February of last year, and I couldn't remember lines where black was allowed to play bishop g4 in my preparation, so I started off by playing h3, and unfortunately this allows the very strong move g5 a la Kramnik, the Iranian Kramnik game from the candidates a couple of years ago, and unfortunately I was in a lot of trouble early on. So it's very important not to allow that and to just play bishop e2. The idea is to play d3 and queen g3. The bishop is very well placed, targeting the h5 square and preventing knight h5, and the plan is to go f4 next. And white gets dangerous attacking chances here, and we shouldn't be worried about bishop g4. If black goes for this, this position won't look like much. The queens come off, but there's still 8 pawns on the board, still 2 minor pieces and 2 rooks each, and there's still some tension in the position. And I think white is not running much risk here. And indeed, this was the choice of Abdusatorov against Wesley So in a recent blitz match, and he won a few games too. So we'll look at those in the notes as well. So in general, I think this is a very good approach, And if you switch between bishop c4 and bishop d3, you'll be able to keep your opponents guessing and have very good chances to score some good wins. Instead, the next option we're going to look at is c5, the Sicilian Defense, which is traditionally black's most popular defense to e4. And here I'm going to recommend to start with knight c3. You can of course start with knight f3, and in 99% of the cases it will transpose, but there's one particular line after knight c3, a6, that I'd like to delay playing knight f3 in, so I think this is more dangerous. We'll look at that in a moment. Instead, let's take a look at 2 knight c6. You'll get this very often, and here we're going to play knight f3. And black has a bunch of options here. Depending on what Sicilian variation he usually goes for, his choice will differ here. So if he plays the Sveshnikov, he may like to play e5 here, in which case this is a very theoretical main line. After bishop c4, white has very good attacking chances in these lines. Bishop e7, d3, and here if black starts with d6, we're going to castle, knight f6, and play the traditional plan with knight g5 attacking f7. And since black has played d6, he has no gambit options with d5, and we'll see what I mean in a moment. He must castle here, and after f4, white has very good attacking chances. There have been a lot of games here, but I've managed to whittle the theory down to a manageable amount, and I think that there are some dangerous ideas for white where he sacrifices in exchange for black's light squared bishop and gets excellent attacking chances and excellent compensation. So we'll check that out. Instead, d3 is the main line, and here I'm going to recommend knight g5 again, but after castles, f4 isn't so effective because black can strike back in the center with d5 and play gets really complicated, and black seems to be doing well. Instead, I'm going to recommend this new idea with h4. This was played by Dubov against Gelfand in 2016, and it's also been tested quite a bit in correspondence, and in general white has very good attacking chances here, and I don't think your opponents will be expecting it. So you can check that out in the relevant chapter. I think it's a really good try for white. Instead, if we go back to move 3, another popular option for black is knight f6, and here I was originally going to recommend bishop b5, which is the Rossolimo, but there's a lot of theory there. Even though it's a good line for white and black is committed to knight f6 earlier than he might have liked, there's an awful lot to learn there for a position that we won't get so often. So instead, I think that e5 is actually surprisingly good for white and very dangerous for black. He can equalize if he's very careful, but the positions are really unclear and haven't been tested very much. And I think armed with my analysis, you'll have great chances to get an edge here and score some quick wins. Another option for black is g6. This is normally played by dragon players or accelerated dragon players, and here I do think we should play bishop b5. And there's a bit of theory here because g6 is the main line when this knight is on b1, but knight c3 isn't played so often, but I can't really understand why. I think it's a very good try for white and it gives him some interesting play. So we'll look at this, and I think once again you'll be better prepared than your opponents and more familiar with the ideas. If you don't fancy that, h4 is another option for white, and it's recently been played by Carlsen in his blitz match against Mamedov. So I think that this is, sorry, not Mamedov. And I think this is a really interesting try for white. He's just planning to blow black away with h5 already, and you can check this out in the bonus chapter. So this could also be your cup of tea, you can go for that as well. Another option to look at is e6. This is another main move we'll face, and here I recommend we just play knight f3. And if we get the chance to play bishop b5, if black develops his knight to c6, we'll take that. Otherwise we can fianchetto on the king side and look forward to playing d3 to d2 to d4, or indeed d3 and set up a close Sicilian attack on the black king. For example, if black plays a6, g3 is a good move, and here we'll put the bishop on g2 and castle and take a look around. In some positions we'll play d4 in one move, in other positions we'll play d3 and try to attack on the king side, and in still other positions we'll play d3 and then d4 later on, which looks like we're losing at tempo, but oftentimes black has played the weakening move d6, and d4 can be even more effective when this has happened. So you can check that all out in the video. Instead, knight c6 is another option for black, and here we'll go bishop b5. And once again, knight c3 is not the most common move here when the knight's on b1 and black plays e6 against the normal Rossolimo, but I think it gives white dangerous attacking chances. And black has a few options here, and we'll check them all out. After knight d4, we can castle, and we're trying to race ahead in development. We don't worry about losing the bishop on b5. And if black plays a6, we retreat to d3. And white has the positional threat of taking on d4 and playing knight e2, attacking the d-pawn. And also I've got some brand new ideas for white here that haven't been tested very often. that I think will be very interesting for you to face, or for you to analyze and study. So you can check those out. Knight e7 is another main line, and after castles, we're going to take on c6 if black provokes us to, and we'll play d4 as well. And we'll try to give up the bishop for a leading development. And I think black has to be very precise here if he wants to equalize, and white has dangerous attacking chances. Another option is 2g6. And here again I'm going to give you two moves. d4 is going to be our main line. This has been the main move that I've played here for the past 4 or 5 years, and I've got very good results with it. And I think it gives white a very decent early initiative and dangerous attacking chances again. So after c takes, queen takes, black must play knight f6, and now we simply develop with knight f3, knight c6, and queen a4. And white plans to play e5 next, and black has to be really careful. I'm not sure he can equalize, and I've given a few options for white to test black in this position. Instead, in the spirit of our line against 2 knight c6 and 3 g6, we can play knight f3 here, and indeed knight c6 will transpose to that, and we can go bishop b5 or h4. And if black plays bishop g7, well, now unfortunately, unless we want to go into an open Sicilian, we're committed to playing h4. But it's quite dangerous here too, and I think you should check this out in the bonus chapter. I think you'll have some good wins here too. Instead, the last sideline I'm going to check is a6. And here, knight f3 is perfectly fine, but I want to recommend the line with g3. And this is why we're leaving our knight on g1. If b5, bishop g2, bishop b7, d3, e6, f4, d5. This line has long been considered to be harmless for black, but in fact I'm going to present you with the new idea, f5. And this is very dangerous for black and gives white excellent attacking chances. The plan is to take on e6. Even if black attacks our knight on c3 with b4 or d4, we're still going to take on e6 and sacrifice a piece. And once again, black will be under fierce pressure right from the start. And I think this is a great weapon for blitz. And for rapid as well. And for classical too. You could go for this. I think it's very dangerous for black. So I think it's worth not playing knight c3 and knight f3 in that position. Just starting with knight c3 and then giving ourselves the option of delaying knight f3 later on, pushing the f pawn. Instead, d6 is traditionally the main line. And here we're going to play knight f3, and this will work very well against any players who are dragon players, classical Sicilian players, or Najdorf players. Black can of course play e5 and will most likely transpose back into our anti-Sveshnikov line, except with black having already played d6. So as we mentioned, that avoids the d5 options for black and leaves white with good attacking chances. Instead, black might try a6, and then we'll go g3, as we usually do against these a6 ideas. And again later on we'll aim to play bishop g2 and perhaps d3 or d4 depending on what black does. If black plays knight c6, then we're going to play bishop b5 again. And here e5 is probably the best move, but I have some ideas against that too. The most natural move is bishop d7, and here I'm excited to present you with a brand new line. Bishop takes c6, followed by d4, c takes, and now the more or less novelty, it has been played a bit, but not very often, knight takes d4. And the idea here is that, well, normally white plays queen takes d4 here, or at least this would be the most common position, and it's often reached via the move order 2 knight f3, d6, and d4, and it's known as the Hungarian variation. And with our move order we'd have avoided a bunch of options for black. For example, here he can play both bishop d7 and a6, as well as the natural knight c6, but in this position white often plays queen back to d3 and knight to d4 in order to build up attacking chances. And if you compare this with the line that I'm proposing with this position where we play knight takes d4 instead, we would be several tempi up on that if we play queen d3 next against black's same setup. We'd be at least 2 moves up, having played queen d3 in one move and the knight already being on d4. But of course white has other options. He can even play queen e2, or in some lines if black plays g6 we can play bishop e3 and queen d2 and get a very good version of the dragon. So I think white has excellent chances here, and I don't think black has shown a clear way to equalize against this either. Plus it's not very well known, and I think you'll be much better prepared than your opponents here. So do check that out as well. Instead, the main line is knight f6, and here I'm going to recommend one of my favorite lines in chess, e5. This is a great anti-Sicilian for white, and I've scored really highly with it. I think I've only dropped one draw against another IM in a classical game with this line. And it's still not very well known. It's still being played in classical games now, and white's still scoring highly with it. Black has one clear way to equalize, but it's never been played against me, and it's not very well known. And even there, I have some new ideas for white, and I think there's plenty of play left in the position. There are lots of tricky lines here for black to face, and I think that you will score really highly with this too. So definitely check that out as well. So we'll go back. I think the next option to look at is the French defense. And here, once again, we're going to recommend the two knights. Knight c3, d5, and knight f3. And here, it doesn't matter which order we play them in, really. Both moves are perfectly fine. Here, black has a few main options. The main point about this line is that we've avoided bishop b4, the winnower variation, which usually takes place with the pawn on d4 and the knight on g1. Here, black can still play bishop b4, but it's not very good, as we'll see in the notes. Instead, black has d takes e4, he has knight f6, these are both moves he has after d4 as well, and also he has the extra option d4. This d4 move has long been considered fine for black, but I have a new idea here for white, knight e2, followed by b4. And I think this leads to very unusual positions and sets unique problems for black. You can check that out in the notes too. Instead, d takes e4 will most likely transpose to one of the Rubinstein variations after knight takes d4, knight takes e4, followed by d4. And black has a few options here. If he plays bishop d7, I'm very excited to show you this line, knight eg5. Bishop c6 is known as, bishop d7 to c6 is known as the Fort Knox variation, but we'll see that it's not very solid against this knight eg5 move. And against most of black's moves, we're just going to take on f7 next and sacrifice a piece. And this is a nightmare for black to defend at a short time control. And I think white objectively has very good attacking chances. So this is a sound option, even though it sacks a piece, and I think it's very difficult for black to defend. The main line would be knight d7 here, and I'm going to recommend d4, knight f6, knight takes, and now knight e5. And here I've played this a bit with black myself, and I came up with a very interesting new gambit idea that has never been played in the database before. So I think it will be a great surprise for your opponents, and I've analysed it quite deeply even still, and I think white gets at least enough compensation in all lines. So you should check that out as well. I'm really excited to present that to you too. Instead, knight f6 would be the main line, and after e5, knight d7, and d4, we're going to reach this position more often than not. The point about putting the knights on f3 and c3 is not that we want to maintain the pawns on d4 and e4, we actually want to swap them off for black c and f pawns if we need to. And then we're going to try and control the d4 and e5 squares with our pieces. So after d takes, knight c6 and bishop f4, black has two main approaches here. He can take back on c5 with the knight or with the bishop. If he takes with the knight, we're going to look at two approaches for white, bishop b5 followed by kingside castling, and queen d2 followed by queenside castling. Obviously castling queenside is sharper, but it's very interesting for white and gives him great attacking chances. And bishop b5 is a sounder option, probably a more sane choice, and it also gives white good chances for an edge. Bishop takes c5 is the main move, and here we'll play bishop d3. And here, black more or less has to play f6. He can do other moves, waiting moves as well, but f6 is usually part of the plan. The main thing is that he can't castle, and because this allows bishop takes h7 check, a winning Greek gift sacrifice. Now the follow-up isn't completely standard for white, so you do need to know what to do here, but I think you can win a lot of games this way, as a lot of unwinning black players maybe pre-move castles kingside online, or simply just fall into the trap. So you'll definitely win some games this way too. But mainly f6 is the best move, and after e takes f6, black can recapture with the queen or the knight. Knight takes is more common. If he takes with the queen, we're just going to castle kingside, and white often tries to target black's central pawns by playing knight a4, followed by c4. The big thing is to try and blockade these pawns and stop them from advancing. And of course with the queen on f6 and the knight on d7, black's pieces are a little bit awkward, and he has to do some work trying to unravel them and get them to sensible squares. So we have plenty of time to try and put pressure on black's center. Instead, knight takes f6 is more reliable, and here once again I'm going to give you two options. Castles kingside, followed by knight e5. This is the positional approach and has been my choice in most of the games I've played here, and I've got a very good score with it. But queen e2 is also really interesting, and after castles kingside, castles queenside, white has very interesting attacking chances, and there haven't been too many games here, and a lot of my analysis is very fresh and hasn't been seen before or played before. So I think you'll have great chances here too to surprise your opponents and know basically more about the positions than they do. So this should be a very pleasant choice for white. Instead, the last opening we're going to look at is the Caro-Kann with c6. And unfortunately here, the two knights approach is actually the most topical line at the moment. so we will have to learn quite a bit of theory here. However, it is a very promising approach for white, and black hasn't really shown the best ways to defend against it yet. I think in over 90% of the lines, white has excellent chances of an edge. So it's a very promising line for white, and that's the reason it's been played so often recently. And hopefully I've managed to show you some brand new ideas that I think will leave you better prepared for your opponent than your opponents, even though they'll be expecting this. So for example, if black plays knight f6, this was an interesting option which sort of revived this line for black recently, say about 10 years ago, at least at very unusual positions. But recently white struck a blow to this variation with knight e2, queen b6, d4, and knight g3. And after c5, bishop d3, black takes on g3. White players discovered that f takes g3 is actually much stronger than taking back with the h-pawn, and white is going to have a massive attack down the f-file, and I haven't been able to find a way for black to equalize here. So I think this is very dangerous for black and a great option for blitz games, and in general it's just a very promising line for white. Instead, d takes e4 is more solid, and we'll spend a bit of time on this. But after knight takes e4, knight f6, and queen e2, you'd be surprised how often knight bd7 is played, allowing knight d6 checkmate. It's happened to me even recently on online blitz with a very strong player. So do watch out for that. But after knight takes e4, queen takes e4, this is the main line. And of course we look at other options for black here too. He has a few of them. And here the most solid move for black is queen d5. And again, I've two lines presented to you in the notes, with queen f4 being the main alternative, but queen h4 is going to be my main recommendation. And I think white has good chances for an edge here too. He'll only exchange the queens on his own terms. We won't take on d5. Knight d7 is a more challenging line to face from a theoretical perspective. Black has some very dynamic ideas involving sacrificing a pawn, but I have analysed this really deeply, and I think black has to be really precise if he wants this to work. The point is, after bishop c4, knight f6 is played, and now instead of moving our queen, we can play knight e5, threatening checkmate on f7, and forcing black to play e6 and block in his bishop on c8. And only now do we retreat the queen. And if black isn't very precise here, he can just be clearly worse already. But b5 is the best move, and I'm going to recommend bishop d3. And black has some interesting pawn sack lines here, but he has to really know his stuff if he wants to get a playable game. And I think white can put pressure on him for a long time to come. Instead, the traditional main line for black has always been bishop g4, and this has been recommended recently in many repertoire sources for black, as it's quite a solid line. But after h3, bishop takes, queen takes, and e6, starting with the main move bishop e2, I think that white has very good chances for an edge here, and I've managed to find some great ideas against those repertoire choices that I mentioned and those other works that I mentioned for black. So I think you'll have a great chance to surprise your opponents if they play into this, and you will get this quite often since it's been recommended in many sources. So I'm really excited to show you these lines, and there are some very beautiful tactics here. So overall, I hope you enjoyed that and are looking forward to playing these lines in your games. I think it's going to be an interesting journey, and I think that white has very good chances in all the lines that I presented, and I hope that you'll score very highly with them. So best of luck, and I'll see you in the next clip. Take care.